Welcome to Maurer Podcast. Today I'm talking with Javier Leiva, and he is the host and creator of Pretend Radio. You may remember that I have mentioned Javier before because he is one of the people who inspired me to podcast in the first place. So, disclosure, we are friends. So welcome, Javier.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so impressed that you're doing a podcast because I love your YouTube channel and podcasts just seem like the natural next step. So I'm glad you stumbled upon it.
Well, thank you. You had a lot to do with that. Yeah. For the people who don't know about Pretend Radio, tell us what it's about.
Well, Pretend Radio started out as I love making documentaries. I'm an old video director, so I love telling stories. Telling video stories is so much harder than telling audio. It's easier to just tell an audio story. So I was like, I'll make little mini documentaries for podcasts. I decided to do this topic about people pretending to be someone else. I was fascinated by that idea, and it actually started because I developed this fear of speaking in public. Yeah, and I used to do stand-up comedy, and I was like, it got to the point where I was scared to speak to my team, like the people that I worked with every day. I'm like, why am I nervous talking to my coworkers? So I needed to get back on stage and overcome this fear. And the only way I could think about overcoming this fear is pretending to be someone else. And that's where the idea came from.
Wow.
And so I was like, I would love to tell stories about other people pretending to be someone else. And at first I thought it was going to be a podcast about actors and ghostwriters and stuff. And it slowly turned into this true crime type podcast about undercover agents, con artists, just people living a lie. I found that the audience really liked those kind of stories. So
it's exciting. I, of course, have listened to all the podcasts, and it is really an exciting topic because some of us, I think, do sometimes have that feeling that we're either an imposter or we're pretending to be somebody else. But as you show, there are people who take that to a crazy level.
Yeah, we all have our inner con artist, right?
Right.
I know I feel that way sometimes. I just started a new job, and I'm like, am I the right person for this job? There's this thing called Imposter Syndrome.
Yes.
Where anybody could feel it's kind of like lack of confidence, but to the extreme. And so that's a small way of telling a pretend story, or it could be this. I'm doing a story right now about this guy who would con people out of their homes.
Oh my. And
he would kill them. He was a serial killer con artist. He's a combo. So you got that, the range is incredible, it's just nuts. So, but I try to make the show not a way to glorify people who are taking advantage of other people, but if you listen to my show and you learn something from it so that you won't be a victim, that's the goal for me, right? If there's something that somebody takes away from one of my shows and they won't become a victim, I feel like we won. But the goal is not to glorify these con artists or these liars,
Yeah, I definitely have sort of taken that from some of your podcasts because it just highlights for you that there are really people out there who are intentionally trying to con you. And you don't necessarily even think that of people.
You know what I've noticed? Because I try to take a journalistic angle with all my stories because I am a journalist, but I study journalism. And so I try to be kind of, neutral, but I can't help sometimes wonder, how did these people fall for this? You know what I mean? How is that possible? And the more you dig into these stories, you find out that these people, these victims, they don't even realize they're getting conned because they are so deep in the con. Once they got you in the con, it's impossible to see what is very obvious to everybody else.
Yeah.
This one story I'm working on now is about this woman who was a millionaire and a con artist. After her husband died, a con artist came in, stole pretty much conned her out of all her money to the point where she couldn't even pay her light bill. Okay.
Wow.
And I'm like, how did you not see this coming? Or like, why didn't you say no to this guy? But once you're in that deep into a con, you can't really, you have no perspective.
So how do you find the people who are the subjects of your podcasts?
That's the number one question I get all the time. And I wish I knew the answer to it because it would make my life a lot easier. There is not one place, right? It's all about keeping, your ear low to the ground. Is that the expression?
Yes.
And I don't like, saying expressions because I always, Ricky Ricardo, then I always mess them up. But, it's all about like reading articles, there are stories that pop up on the AP wire that are fascinating, and they just pop up and then they disappear and nobody ever follows up on them. And so like that's one way. Another way is like, this is silly, but I already know what kind of story I want to cover. So like I knew I wanted to cover a story about a snake oil salesman, because it's just a classic con artist story, right? And so I start out with the concept, and then I go and I start digging, and I try to tie the concept to a real story,
Right.
And then I start finding either the victims, or I always try to approach the actual con artists themselves to see if they would tell their side of the stories, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
But,
so who did you really want to get that just said no?
oh man, it's a very long list, but I could tell you my two favorites. The list of people that don't want to be on my show is very long, but actually I have three that are pretty memorable. So the guy who inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can, he, I got pretty close to his inner circle, but he rejected me. There's a con artist, this French con artist from the documentary on Netflix called The Imposter, which is, check it out. He pretty much cussed me out on Facebook and told me to take a long walk. And I know, but it was awesome. It was like the best rejection ever. And then the third one, who I'm still talking to, and we were really close to getting the interview, but she said no. Do you remember the former NAACP Spokane, Washington president, Rachel Dolezal? We've been talking, and I almost had her in season 1, and she had a new book, and then she decided not to do it. She didn't close the door, but she decided not to do it.
Well, I hope she does do it. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, but I mean, you win some, you lose some, and I've had more wins than losses. So.
Yes. You've had some great ones. So who is the one person that you would just love to get? Who would be your absolute favorite person to get?
I'll tell you who the one person that most people request me to interview is. He's in DC right now, but I don't think he'll be available for an interview.
Oh, I think I can guess who that might be.
Yeah.
Okay. So, of the people that you have interviewed so far, or the subjects of your episodes so far, did somebody surprise you, even though you knew their story? Was there a surprise to you?
Yeah, I'm literally surprised every time I do an interview because, I go in knowing a lot about the story. I kind of know where the story is going, and yet I'm always surprised. But one particular interview that kind of surprised me and also surprised the person who I was interviewing, was the undercover agent. I interviewed this FBI undercover agent.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, his story was great. And when I put it together, it fascinated me when I was talking to him. It fascinated me and surprised me when I was editing it. And then after I put it together and put it on the air and he listened to it, it fascinated him. He was like, this is my story. And I'm shocked, he said, you had me at the edge of my seat. And then that's what I try to do with my show. I try to make I have a news angle to it, but I want to make it entertaining. And so the way I drip information, I'm not giving you a traditional news story. It starts out with the most important information on top.
Right.
Okay. And then they kind of work their way down. I don't take that approach. I want to start the story. Sometimes if it's best to start the story in the middle, just drop the listener in the middle of the action. and they don't know a lot. They
Right.
just know what's happening, and then I'm slowly painting a picture around that scene. And I like to reveal information. I think that's where the suspense comes in.
They're really beautifully edited. And that one actually was the podcast that had me most on the edge of my seat, because a lot of the people are imposters and they're devious, but that guy his job was to be an imposter. And it was life or death for him to pull it off.
You know, I think we all have secret fantasies about being in the FBI, or, you know, the movies glorify it. But here I am talking to this real undercover FBI agent, and there's one scene in particular that
I think I know what it is.
Yeah, once you listen to it, no one's going to want to sign up for the FBI after that.
No.
You know, he's in this room with this, you know, mafioso type guy, and his goons are right behind him, and it just goes south. Right? It goes south really fast.
Right.
And how he got out of that situation alive. I mean, this is not acting. This is like he's acting for his life.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, this is like real life. And these guys do this all the time. And you know what's amazing about these FBI guys? They play these incredible roles, undercover roles, right? Day or night. And yeah, sure, they're eating fancy restaurants with mob bosses or whatever, but when that's all done, they go back to their hotel room or wherever they are staying, and then they got to do paperwork.
Yeah.
And like nobody ever talks about that, right?
Right.
They have to like file all those receipts for those fancy dinners.
Right. Call their
yeah.
wife and
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, they're like real people at the end of the. It's, to me, that story stands out.
I think that one, and also the one about the real estate agent.
Yeah, that one to me disturbed me, because I actually am really pleased with the way it turned out. Like, I felt like I told the story unlike anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Dr. Phil has covered this story. 48 Hour has covered this story, and some other podcasts have covered the story. But I don't feel like anybody has covered this story the way I did it, and I feel like I did it really well. But at the end of that, I was sick. I was so sick of like being in that serial killer's mind,
being immersed in it. And I went and saw the video. It's on your it's on your website. The video of the woman being recovered from that.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a happy ending. Not to spoil it,
for
because
her, for some,
for
but
her,
not for everybody.
But the show starts off, just for your listeners who haven't listened to my show. The story starts out with police investigators approaching this chain container, and they don't know what they're going to find in there.
That is bolted shut or
It's bolted. Yeah. It's chains shut, and they're like, you know, with a saw trying to saw through the chains and a crowbar to open up the container. And guess what they find inside? They find a woman chained to the back of the shipping container. Okay, and with like moldy food, and like she's, you know, living like an animal.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, even animals don't get treated that way.
Right.
But she was found alive.
Mm-hmm.
And like, to me, that is a happy ending, I guess, but to such a tragic story. But
Yeah.
what a unique situation. I mean, I chose this story out of all these stories because the guy who held her there was a successful real estate agent. To me, the pretend angle there was that he was pretending to live this normal life. He had commercials on TV, you know, he had keys to people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, he had a girlfriend, and she had a kid, and everything seemed fine. And then in the background, he has these women locked up in shipping containers.
And bodies.
And bodies buried in his backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just very disturbing, but it was a really interesting story that I thought was worth sharing.
Yeah, it was interesting, but and it's one thing to listen to it, but I imagine that you did have to be so immersed into it.
What people don't realize about that particular episode, and the reason why I say that I told the story unlike anybody else, is because I actually took the time to listen to all the confession tapes. And you don't understand, like, there's hours and hours of these confession tapes, and they're not told in a linear fashion. In fact, it was a terrible investigation. In fact, if you ever have time and you listen to the story, I invite you to go back and YouTube some of the the questioning that the police did, it was terrible. The guy was basically pouring his, heart out, like telling, detail after detail about his crime. And the police were just like fumbling through this. They were nervous. They were nervous talking to this guy. And so what I did was I listened through hours and hours and hours of confession tapes, and I crafted a story out of it. And so that's why I feel like I was able to tell the whole story, because I took the time, and that's the kind of dedication that I pour into every story. That's why, I can't pump out a lot of episodes, because I make sure that I flesh everything out.
So how did you become this storyteller? How did that happen?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've always gravitated to telling stories. Even as a kid, I wanted to be an animator. But I think once I started working in news, that's where it really kicked in, the whole mechanism of telling stories, because it is science. I mean, it's art, but it's also science, the way you tell a story. Mm-hmm. And I learned that there, and I also made some documentaries, and I've produced a lot of commercials and videos for corporations. So the story part has always been part of my profession. But this has been the first opportunity to tell a story the way I want to tell a story, and not, the way my clients want me to tell a story.
You started by saying that audio is easier than video, but there are also challenges to audio in telling a story, because you can't, have the silence and just the visuals. So what have been the challenges for you?
Can I tell you that as a correction, so audio is easier because you don't have the complications of cameras and lights, and all that stuff is very intrusive, and the kind of stories that I'm telling, I don't have the resources to travel places. But audio has made me a better storyteller, because not having the option of showing you what I'm saying, like that scene of the woman trapped in the shipping container,
right? You described
you saw it in your mind's eye, and so it made me actually a better storyteller, because now I'm painting a picture for you in ways that I become a better writer because of it. Because in video, I don't need to tell you what you're seeing. You're seeing it. In mm-hmm. radio, you're really fleshing the scene out. And I actually feel like I've grown professionally just with this project.
It is interesting just from a historical perspective, because, I came from YouTube. So I'm going YouTube to podcasting. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it feels like taking a step back in time, and at the same time feeling very modern, because that's what my father did. He and his family sat in front of a radio and listened to stories. He mm-hmm. was born before television, and then of course later they got the television. Right. It is an old style, but why do you think as modern society we're going back to that now?
So I have a funny story. I told you I studied journalism, and when you study journalism, there's a fork in the road, and you got to figure out, am I going to do TV news? Am I going to do print news? Am I going to do radio?
Right.
And, right around the time where we're all trying to figure that out, I chose TV because I'm a visual guy. That was an easy call. But I remember this, and I don't even know if it was a woman or a man. Like, somebody told me, I think I'm going to do radio. And this was early 2000s. And I'm thinking, God, why would you do radio? It's a dying industry. At the time, it really was dying. Like, I was thinking, this is such a waste of your parents' money.
Right.
And little did I know that the renaissance of radio is just around the corner. I think there hasn't been a more exciting time to be in radio, because anyone with a microphone, and the microphone could be your iPhone, could start a podcast and tell great stories. There are podcasts that I listen to that are not extremely well produced, and that's okay. I don't care, because the content is so good. Mm-hmm. I mean, so good. They're real professionals telling real stories, and to me, that's what it's all about. If you're telling a good story, I could forgive bad audio. I could forgive the lack of music or sound design or polish. I just want to hear good stories.
Sometimes there's a satisfaction to the grittiness, mm-hmm. Like on YouTube sometimes, that they're not overproduced, that you feel closer to the person who's actually doing it.
Yeah. In fact, sometimes I dirty up my audio because it sounds too polished. So like if I'm interviewing somebody and it sounds super crisp, I actually dirty it up so it could sound a little bit more like authentic and real.
Oh, you're telling your secrets
Yeah,
now.
no, but I do that because like I listen back to it and I'm like, that just sounds overproduced.
Right.
So I knock it down a bit.
Nice. One of the things that's interesting to me coming from YouTube to podcasting is it's kind of hard to tell on podcasting if anybody's listening. I mean, you can tell somewhat, but you just don't have the kind of analytics you do on...
It's not like YouTube. Like on YouTube, I could go on your channel and see how many people watched a particular video. On podcast, not so much. It's kind of a dark medium where like no one, not even Ira Glass with This American Life, knows exactly how many subscribers he has. Isn't that a wild concept?
So how do you know, like, do you have any idea kind of where your listeners are? Or I'm always fascinated on YouTube when, somebody says, hey, I live in Netherlands or, whatever, but do you know where they are and who they are?
It's crazy. And I'm sure you experience this with your YouTube channel too. But I'll wake up in the morning and I'll already have like 100 downloads. And it's like, who are these people? And it's people in Australia. Like actually in New Zealand and Australia, like I actually have a pretty decent following. Like
nice.
It's amazing.
Sounds like you could write off a trip to New Zealand or Australia.
That's what I'm thinking. No, but I do secretly fantasize about, this is just a hobby. I never started this with the dream of like becoming the next big podcast. Like seriously, this was a way for me to express myself creatively, and the fact that people like it, that's awesome. But now that people like it, I secretly fantasize about doing like a live show in Australia. Like I don't even know what that will look like, but if enough people listen down there, why not?
That's exciting. I think it would look like fun.
I try, like, unless people ask me about my podcast, I don't really tell people about it. But like, I feel like I lived this double life too,
You started off season 1 with this story about a cult in Western North Carolina, or they would say a church, I would say a cult. And you kind of left us hanging there. Is there more to that?
There's a lot. I could make the whole podcast about this church. It is the reason why it's interesting. I mean, there are a lot of podcasts out there that cover cults, but this one is different because it's ongoing. It's an ongoing cult. And even as I was reporting on it in season 1, there was still stuff happening. And that's why I think it's such an important story to tell, because this church, who, like you said, some people call it a cult, and it actually has every sign of a cult. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has a very authoritative leader who cannot be questioned.
It's difficult to leave.
Yeah, it's difficult to leave. They're not recruiting, and they could only work at church businesses. But all that, that's not hurting anybody. That's just kind of strange, right? But the reason why this story is important is because there's reports about abuse, mm-hmm. and in season 1, I had secret recordings of the church leader, the head pastor. Her name is Jane Whaley. It's a woman who was commanding someone to be dropped to the ground and beaten. And I have that on tape. That was the first time anybody heard that recording. It was on my podcast.
It was terrifying.
Yeah, it was very scary. So you're now going from a weird church with weird rules to, people getting abused, kids getting abused.
Crimes.
Okay? Yeah, and it was happening as I released episode 1, 2, and 3 for season 1. And right around the time when I was releasing episode 1, 2, and 3, there was and I was reporting on it. I kind of alluded about it at the end of episode 3, but this church has a satellite church in Brazil and in Ghana. And actually the church in Brazil, like the church in North Carolina only has 700 members. The church in Brazil has thousands of members.
Oh my.
Okay, so they're going international. So my question was, wait, I want to talk to somebody who goes to the church in Brazil. And it took me a long time, but I finally got an interview with a former member from the Brazilian church. And it was crazy to see how they were able to replicate not only the weird rules and the screaming prayers that they have, but also the abuse. happens down there as well.
And what about the person who's talking directly to God? Were they able to replicate that?
Everything. I mean, like, it is a mirror image. Even their main sanctuary, like, is a mirror image of the North Carolina church. They were able to replicate it in a South American country. It's just incredible. And the personal story that I was able to capture was heartbreaking. It was about this man a young man. He was a young man who is homosexual, was trying to figure out his sexuality while being in this church. And, you know, he was abused and he finally left the church, but his story is heartbreaking. But that's a story worth telling. So I knew that I needed to tell that story. But also something weird happened as I released these 3 stories about the church. Right as I was on the air, a death occurred. There was a death of somebody who is related to the church, okay? And I couldn't report on it then because it was too fresh. But it's been 6 months, and that death still hasn't been declared a murder or a suicide. And so I'm digging into it too, and that's really interesting. You know, it's not church related, but it is kind of in that same orbit, and so I'm telling that story as well. So there are a lot of stories that are coming out about this church, and even by the time season 2 comes out, there's going to be more stories because it just keeps coming out. It's an active story.
Wow. So when can we expect season 2? I'm very excited.
Me too. Well, I have almost everything ready, and I should be launching it, early 2018. So,
okay.
Yeah, I would highly recommend your listeners to listen to those first 3 episodes because they're going to be very important when season 2 comes around. Yeah.
So your wife married this guy who is in video journalism, does animation, all this fun stuff, and now what?
Yeah, all these crazy stories that I shared with you today, she has to listen to this all the time. And she doesn't see it the way we see it. She's like, why did you get into this? Why are you doing this?
You're doing this for fun?
For free? Yeah, I am. I'm doing it for free. And she's super supportive. Yeah. I always call her my executive producer because by the time I finish an episode, I'm so sick of it. And I let her have it. And she'll give me raw feedback, and she's great. Yeah. She's a good sounding board.
And as a good wife, I'm sure honest feedback.
Honest feedback, and I'm sure she's so tired of me talking about it.
Right. She's going, yes, it's done. Yeah. We can move on to the next subject.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Javier. This was very intriguing. It's so nice to hear you tell sort of the design and the kind of the behind the scenes of your podcast.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the show because a lot of my listeners never get to hear the behind the scenes and the design point of view.
And hello to all of those fans in Australia.
Yeah. Hello, mate. I guess that's how you say it.
I guess so.
I'm not good with American sayings, so I'm definitely not good with Australian.
No, I have a feeling, though, if you get on Australian TV, you'll be able to coach us all on how to do that.
Yeah, exactly.